One expectation as the Trump administration took office was that the regulatory landscape might see some significant change, and that still could be some of the case with some of the potential impacts playing out. But will the regulations themselves change, especially in and around the banking sector? Pleasure to be joined right now by David Zaring, who is professor of legal studies and business ethics here at the Wharton School. Hi, David. Great to talk to you again.
It's great to be here, Dan.
All right. So, as the election played out, and you're thinking about the landscape of regulation, what were your thoughts about what we potentially could see with some of the rhetoric that had been put out there?
Yeah, I thought there could be some real differences between sort of second Biden term and Trump administration term. Maybe not as many in financial regulation as you might see in other places. The Biden administration had tried very hard to get a new capital rule across the finish line, and they eventually failed to do that. So I assume they were going to come back with something, but the Trump administration has also said, or at least Chairman Powell has said, that the Fed wants to do a Basel III endgame rule. That's the rule that the Biden administration couldn't get done. And so we'll see if that happens. But in some ways, I think financial regulation may well be different. I think there's a concern that there's too burdensome set of sort of oversight on normal banks, and that's going to change maybe. There'll be some tailoring of rules to make it more modest. The CFPB is obviously going to be completely different over the course between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. That's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which the Trump administration looks like they kind of want to shut down. And then I think is a really different approach to crypto.
So is it not necessarily then the regulations themselves, but how maybe the agencies would work? You mentioned the CFPB. There's talk about, maybe some changes and different approach there. There's talk about maybe cutting regulators from the Treasury Department. So it might not necessarily be the regulations, but how these agencies work.
Yeah, I think that will be something. Excuse me. And one of the things that you have seen, and I wonder if this will change a little bit, but banks used to be worried that their supervisors would sanction them on the basis of reputational risk. And that is the risk that you're sort of doing business with some unsavory or maybe unsound client that's going to be bad for your reputation. And banks complained a lot during the Biden administration that they were being sort of encouraged to debank crypto firms and to maybe consider getting out of energy lending because of reputational risk. You don't want to be seen as somebody who's opposed to, caring about the planet, that kind of thing. And the Trump administration is completely getting rid of reputational risk as something supervisors can consider. But the way they did it is kind of interesting because they just sent out a memo to all their supervisors and told them to stop considering reputational risk. So the problem there is in the next, Elizabeth Warren or whatever administration, she can just rescind that memo and put back another memo. And so that's a difference where, personnel is all that matters, but personnel doesn't always change regulation for forever. And so I sort of wonder if they'll think about doing a rulemaking on stuff like reputational risk, which would be more permanent.
Does this, to a degree, though, show how much the focus around the banking sector in the wake of the financial crisis, the changes that were made were really even maybe more substantive than we gave them credit for?
Yeah, I think there was some sense that the Dodd-Frank and the Obama administration after the financial crisis didn't do enough to reform a financial system that had really gone awry. And I thought that the pandemic suggested that maybe the Obama administration had done a pretty good job there. The banking system really sailed through that crisis with flying colors, and it was not an easy crisis for other sectors of the economy by any stretch of the imagination. So that is, reform that maybe worked out fine. And now the question is, as the financial crisis gets further and further in the rearview mirror, banks are going to complain, well, we're being overregulated. When we finalize this Basel III capital rule, you're departing too much from the minimum standards that is really where we should be. To create a level playing field at the global level, and not gold plate there. And I think that we're seeing a current administration that looks like it's going to be receptive to some of those complaints. And so there you may not just see difference in personnel and policy of the administration, but some sort of more longer term efforts to ease that regulatory burden.
Well, take a moment and talk for a second about Basel III and the potential impact that it could have, because we talk so much about, the banking sector in the U.S., but there are certainly been instances we've seen play out in the last few years of banks overseas and in Europe specifically that have had their issues and have kind of gone awry of the rules.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's fair to say that American regulators kind of take the position that European banks are systematically undercapitalized, and that doesn't matter for all of them, but that does mean that some of them are not sort of resilient to a bunch of crises, which have proven to be problematic for the European Union, where the economy isn't so great, and so the banking sector is finding that lending's difficult, and asset valuations are hard to improve upon, and then in addition, you had this effort to sort of finalize the Basel III capital accords, to make sure that everybody was well capitalized. And that's sort of hit a pause right now because the United States can't figure out exactly what it wants to do. And so the European Union said, okay, well, we'll wait to see what happens in America, and depending on what they do, that'll affect what we do. And the same thing goes for the United Kingdom as well. So, we had this sort of global agreement that was supposed to create uniform standards for banks, and it's largely done that. But the most recent effort to, improve upon those standards is really kind of in turnaround while everybody waits to see what, if anything, the United States does.
Well, then I'll wrap it up with this. What are you most watchful on then right now in terms of how the landscape could potentially be adjusted in the months ahead?
I will be interested in seeing if the U.S. is serious about finalizing its Basel III obligations. I'll kind of be interested in knowing, once it does that, what's it think about these mid-sized regional banks? There's a ton of them in Europe, and there were some in the United States, and there was a blip in 2023 that really affected those regional banks. And so one of the things that the Biden administration's proposal wanted to do was bring them into the toughest aspect of Basel III. And I think it's a very open question as to whether the current administration will continue that effort. So I'll be interested to see, does Basel happen? If it does, what happens to those mid-sized banks in the United States? And then I'll be looking at sort of gobbledygook stuff like the supplemental leverage ratio, and whether that continues to be applied or exempts treasury bills. Banks care a lot about this, and
Yeah.
hopefully your listeners do too.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, David, always great to chat. Thanks very much for your time today. All the best.
Yeah, happy to do it.
You got it. David Zaring, professor of legal studies and business ethics here at the Wharton School.